Are the adverse childhood experiences. You may have already heard of that. If not, this is your introduction to what they are. The ACEs are relatively new, if in the context of the field of mental health, but they are a helpful tool. What they do is not predict any outcome or behavior or issue, but they do speak to risk factors. So we're going to talk about the ACEs, and I actually do have, and I'll pass out the questionnaire and what they are for you to have a copy for yourself, and also self-report if you feel comfortable doing so today, or you can take it home with you as well. So we're going to get into it. So I won't read this whole thing, but kind of just highlight some of the facts and figures as it relates to the ACEs. So they do have a long-lasting impact on your adult outcomes and your well-being well into adulthood. So they are measured based on things that have happened prior to the age of 18. For Black individuals, the ACEs can also be exacerbated by other things such as poverty, racism, community violence. Many other factors can exacerbate those ACEs, systemic issues. And so it's not measured when you take the ACEs, those factors, but they can compound on top of that. So one of the main areas of childhood trauma that are going to be measured through the ACEs are abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. It's really, really easy to experience one or more of those things, especially if you're in battle with socioeconomic distress, poverty, racism, community dysfunction. It can be compounded by some of these things that are going on, and what can ultimately lead to adult mental health issues, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. In Black communities, we are disproportionately affected by the ACEs. So statistics will show that we have a higher rate of experiencing ACEs, and we also have a lower rate of care, mental health care. So compounded with that and not addressing those things, these things can create issues in adulthood, which impact the entire community. So what's going to be helpful is to understand not just what the ACEs are, but how we can prevent them, what we can do to stop them before they happen and not just treat them after the fact. So we're going to go into different things that the studies have shown, right? When they measure the ACEs and the impact of ACEs on Black children compared to the others, we'll say, because it's not necessarily just Black versus white, 61% of Black children experience at least one ACE compared to 40% of white children. And so that is a big difference. And so knowing that the facts are showing that we are disproportionately affected means that we also need more to address these concerns and these issues. And then it just the CDC is who measures this, who takes these facts and figures. So these are things that you can go and research and see how historically they are trending up in our community. So what are the ACEs? They are here for you, and they are subsectioned into three categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So abuse encompasses physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Neglect, physical and emotional neglect, and then household dysfunction, which could be mental illness, incarcerated relatives, abuse towards parents, domestic violence, substance abuse, and then divorce or separation or abandonment. So these are the ACEs. So there's 10. So it's scored on a scale of 1 to 10. 0 actually is a score as well. And this is what they are. So they're represented. It's a very simple measure. It's designed to be easy to take because it's a self-report measure. So these are the categories that they are divided into. What I want to talk about a little more in depth is what is the impact of the ACEs and what does it lead to. So we talk about trauma a lot, but I wanted to highlight complex trauma. So complex trauma is exposure to multiple traumatic events. And typically when you have someone with a high ACEs score, they are going to experience complex trauma, which is different from just one traumatic event like a natural disaster or a car accident, something acute. So complex trauma is what I wanted to highlight, starting with childhood trauma. So these events are severe and pervasive and long term typically. So they compound on top of each other and usually start early in life. When we're talking about ACEs, we're talking about the developmental period in which children are exposed to these traumatic events or these adverse childhood experiences. So the years of life that are most impacted are the ages from 0 to 3, which is infancy, and toddlers, right? And so a lot of the experiences that they have during that window of time can shape how their brain develops and how it changes. And that's a very neuroplastic time period where your brain is being developed and the neurons are firing and wiring together. And so it can be embedded in the development process. And they often occur with their caregiver. So their caregiver is your mother, your father, the person who is most likely responsible for you in those first 3 years of life. And it's not always your parent, but your primary caregiver is the one that's going to expose you to either safety or harm. And that's where it typically will begin, and then it can compound from there. These can also impact their physical development, not just their mental and cognitive development or their emotional development, but their physical health. So you may find that they're experiencing a lot of medical issues as well, on top of the emotional, behavioral, and mental health concerns that you'll see. So complex trauma is really where we want to interject treatment into that aspect of what can come from the ACEs. So the trauma exposure is often layered and systemic. So it's not just the caregiving relationship, it's also the environment that a child is brought up in. So thinking about the household, where they live, if they have a stable living environment, if there's community violence, if they're growing up in a high crime area where violence is prevalent, financial instability, socioeconomic disparities, and then school inequities. So compounded with what's going on at home and how they're being cared for and taken care of, also is the environment in which they live. Then you have the relationships. You have caregivers who are under stress, who now are charged with taking care of and bringing up this child in this environment. And then they may be having unmet emotional needs. They may have love present, but the capacity could be limited. And then, of course, the racial traumas that our nation has been plagued with, and being able to compound that as well. Even though we've come a long way, there's a genetic and historical, what do we call it, generational curse. It's kind of built in, and so it does impact us even today. And then the microaggressions. These are something that isn't necessarily overt. It can be covert, where you experience code switching, where you have to navigate different environments and show up differently depending on the setting or the scene, and the feeling of being watched, judged, and misunderstood. So all of these things, coupled with how you were raised and grown up, can impact you in adulthood. So it's not just one thing that we're dealing with. I want to talk a little bit about what happens in the body. So trauma is not just a mental thing. It's not something we just think about and experience cognitively. It happens physically in the body. So the body is learning how to survive before the mind can understand what's happening. And so I wanted to just touch on this a little bit, because what is trauma is essentially, it's how your nervous system gets impacted and triggered. So your nervous system states fight, flight, or freeze, which you may have heard of this response, is what gets activated when you're exposed to a traumatic event or triggered by a traumatic event. And your body goes into protection mode to try to protect you. And why is this important? Well, if that is turned on and then it's compounded by complex stress and repeated traumatic incidents or abuse or neglect, it can come to a place where it doesn't get turned off. And that can follow you into adulthood. And so what you will find, which is manifested through what someone might diagnosis of mental health disorder is actually just a dysregulated nervous system due to trauma and traumatic events that were never addressed or healed from. And so this is just a model of what's called a polyvagal chart. The polyvagal theory is just it's a model that describes what's happening within the body. So you can be in one of three states. The ventral vagal, which is the safety state here, where you're calm and you're regulated, you're grounded, you're settled, you're not reactive to the things around you. And then you have a sympathetic state, which you recognize danger, or the body recognizes something as dangerous. Even though it may be benign, it's responding to it as if it's in danger. And this is where the fight or flight parasympathetic nervous system response is activated. And this is where you see anxiety and stress and frustration and anger and rage and all of the things that the symptoms that we try to treat on the outside is actually happening internally in the nervous system state. And then the dorsal vagal is the freeze response. This is where you may get a diagnosis of depression because it's unmotivated, I'm fatigued, I'm tired, I'm sad, I'm not able to act, and that's called the freeze response. It's actually also a shutdown response, and so shutting down is a protective mode that the body goes into when it's exposed to trauma or extreme stress. And so this is what we're treating on the outside, but it's actually an internal mechanism that has happened over time and been hardwired into the body and the system. So when you get that stress response activated and then you don't turn it off, and it just stays on all the time, this is the result of what you might see behaviorally. And especially, you start seeing it in childhood and then it can continue into adulthood, and then we're responding to the symptoms of that. So the body is learning how to survive. When it is exposed to trauma or stress or abuse or neglect, it wants to adapt to that so that it can survive. That is just human nature, is to try to survive. And so we want to try to address it before we get into that. But once it gets turned on, there are ways to regulate the nervous system and to bring it back down. And it's not only just fine through mental health treatment or seeing a professional, there are other ways we can do that as well. So we'll get into that. These are just some of the impacts that you might see from what could be a high-risk score on the ACEs. So, and I think I didn't mention that, but so anything that's 4 or more on the ACEs score, so 4 points, each question is worth a point or more, is considered high risk. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have these outcomes, but it does increase your risk for doing so. 0, of course, is always going to be best, but anything 1 to 3 is considered lower risk. 4 or more is higher risk. So these are some of the outcomes that you might see when you have a higher ACEs score. So the mental health outcomes, you may see presentations of anxiety, depression, substance abuse disorders, or PTSD. There are others, but those are just the ones that are more prevalent. The physical impact, which we don't typically attribute to ACEs, is what can happen in the body. So you may see that someone has a chronic medical condition or health condition and not attribute it to trauma, when it very likely could be in response to what the body is doing because they've experienced trauma. So high blood pressure, chronic stress, body tension, hypertension. Also, what I didn't list there is gastrointestinal disorders. A lot of GI issues also can be triggered by trauma or high stress. Also headaches, a lot of headache, migraine, things like that. Coping behaviors, things that people do to try to cope with their traumatic stress response. Overworking, emotional shutdown, substance use, hyperindependence. These are things that you will probably see more in adulthood and not necessarily in children. Their reactions are typically going to be behavioral that you'll see in an effort to cope, or physical. And then the relational patterns that are impacted. Difficulty trusting, fear of being vulnerable, and then the push-pull dynamics in relationships. So you're going to see it, the impacts of traumatic stress or high ACE score in mental, physical, relational patterns, and then you're gonna see people attempting to cope. And one way they do that is being always aware, always adjusting, always carrying with them the memories of what have happened. Even if the memory is not accessible, it does reside in the body and it does continue on until it is brought to the surface. And so these are some of the impacts that you'll see, and this is not at all encompassing list, but just a good overview of what you might see manifested in adulthood. So want to talk briefly about what supports healing. What can we do about it? So we can have the numbers, we can have the facts and the figures of how prevalent it is or how pervasive it is in the community, but we want to also talk about what can support healing. And that the number one thing is going to be safe relationships, and then there's some others as well. But the reason I want to highlight the safe relationships piece is typically where the harm occurred within relationship with a caregiver, a parent, another extended family member, or someone who violated the safety and the trust of a child. And so what supports it is having safe relationships, and that's not always done within the household that they're growing up in. So it is important to highlight community, because community can come together and step in where the family of origin or the household that the child is in or has grown up in is not available to repair or heal that harm. Cultural identity, having a sense of community amongst others of the same culture is also helpful, because there's a sense of belonging, and knowing who you are, where you're from, and who you can connect to, who is like you. So being able to, in adulthood, find healing through safe relationships, having a good sense of self, community, and then expression, having a way to get it out. The body keeps the score, right? And that's a book that I also wanted to recommend as a really good tool to learn about what happens with trauma. And so being able to express it and get it out. A lot of the times there's a lot of shame and secrecy around some of these adverse childhood experiences that you're never able to get them out or let them out or let anyone know. So having a space to be able to express it, whether it's through talk therapy or some other form of expression, because sometimes it's not accessible verbally, is going to be helpful in supporting healing. We can't heal what we don't know about and what we don't get out. Healing also happens in the body. So I brought up the chart on what's happening with the nervous system, because that is where we want to target healing, not just talking about how we think about the issue, but what happens in the body and how we can regulate the nervous system. And so these are some of the methods, very briefly, that can be utilized, which is like somatic therapy methods: sound, stillness, breath, and connection. So being able to regulate the nervous system outside of just talking it down or talking ourselves or calming ourselves down through words, but using some of these tools that are more holistic to be able to start the healing process within the body. We have to calm down the nervous system. We have to regulate it in order to be able to speak now to the cognitive side of healing, and being able to separate past from present. So some of the best practices are going to be prevention. So it's not just addressing what happens after the fact, but actually looking to what can we do to prevent adverse childhood experiences from happening. Early prevention is going to be the best thing, but it's not always available. For whatever reason, we aren't always able to get into the home of children as they're developing, because there's a lot of, again, secrecy and hiding and things that aren't exposed to be able to have someone to come in unless something really extreme happens. A lot of the time it's a reaction to an extreme event, or someone gets hurt, and then maybe a social service agency may step in. But what typically where the behaviors typically show up most early is in the schools. So it's usually the behavioral issues or the challenges or the stressors that you're going to see in a child are going to manifest in the school setting first. So that is kind of one of the most first lines of defense, is just having the educators also be aware of what they're seeing and not just label a child as difficult or having a behavioral issue or having an anger issue when likely there's something going on in the household that has created this response and it's coming out and manifesting in that way. So even early childhood education, so preschool, being able to step in at that level to create community. Sometimes a parent is doing it alone and they don't have access to the supports that they need, and so it's harder for them to create the stable, safe, nurturing environment that a child needs in order to thrive. And so being able to have that community piece, high quality child care and support, extended family support, which isn't always available because maybe the parent family of origin was just as bad or was just as harmful to them, and so they don't have that resource to rely on. So it really requires the community coming together and the village coming together to step in to create that nurturing, safe, and stable environment. Family economic support, that's another thing that is not to be treated lightly when the resources aren't there to provide the stable, nurturing home environment. That could create a domino effect. So being able to have that economic support, and then parenting skill training. I don't know about you, I'm a parent. And I never had any parenting skill training. I was just, hey, you raise it, figure it out. So I had to learn as I went. I had to figure out what to do. So I don't ever recall anybody offering me or me even volunteering or searching for parenting skill training when I was raising my children. I just thought I knew what I was doing and tried to figure it out and hope for the best that I didn't mess it up. But parenting skill training, I think it is available, yes, but it's not widely promoted, I think. And so you need help. The resources are there, but being able to implement these at a very early age will pay dividends and outcomes for children when their parents have that support. Key strategies: strengthening household financial security, promoting positive social norms, and ensuring access to mental health services in early childhood education. And that I do want to lean in on a little bit. So ensuring access to mental health services. I don't know if you've taken a look at the ACEs and kind of self-reported in your head, but does anyone here have at least 3 or more ACEs? I have 4 myself. So it doesn't take a lot to be high risk, but I can tell you this: I never ever was offered any access to mental health when I was a child. I didn't even know that existed. I think that I was just in my own little world. I never even thought that therapy was an option for me in childhood and even well into adulthood. I don't think I saw my first therapist until I was in my 30s. So having access to mental health services is one thing, utilizing them is another. And so thinking about how many of us have been impacted but not had access to mental health services, and thinking about the caregivers that may be the catalyst for some of these adverse childhood experiences, and did they have access to or opportunity to receive mental health services? And a lot of the times the answer is no. So the person who's causing the harm also did not get, or was likely also harmed and also did not get access to mental health services or early childhood education. So the resources now being available is getting people to use it. And that is also another uphill battle, because a lot of the times people are not going to utilize them because of the stigma associated with seeking care, and also because, again, the secrecy. If you don't talk about it, if you don't admit that these things have happened, then you don't have to address it, and you don't have to deal with it, and you don't need to talk to anybody in the office about it. And so then the healing is limited, and the process of healing is stunted because of that. So some of the resources, this is just a link to some of the facts and figures that I gathered the data from for the slideshow, where you can find out more information. Another thing that I brought, which I recommend, is there are 2 really good resources. There's 2 books. There's one that's called The Body Keeps the Score. This is a really, really well-known book, at least in the field of psychotherapy, but it's available to everyone. A lay person can access it as well. This is a really good book that describes what happens with trauma and how the brain, mind, and body are impacted by trauma. But then it also has a lot of good tools on how to start the healing process as well. So it's written by medical doctor Bessel van der Kolk, who is very, very famous in this field on his work with trauma. And he also works with children. And so what he also talks about, and I wanted to mention, is in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Health Disorders. It's a big, big book of all the mental health disorders and the diagnoses that therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists use. There is no diagnoses for childhood trauma. And they worked and studied and tried to get them to put it in the DSM, but they refused to do that. So he and his colleagues proposed adding a diagnosis for developmental trauma disorder for children, and they rejected that. So it's a public health crisis, but it is not being treated as seriously as it should. And so they even say how children are being misdiagnosed a lot of the time with disorders such as ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder and RAD, reactive attachment disorder, and all these other disorders, when really it's developmental trauma that they're experiencing. And so you cannot treat something that does not have a diagnosis, at least in the medical model of therapy, which is what the DSM runs on. So even though we may promote, hey, go see a mental health therapist, go see a counselor to treat these issues, sometimes that work is even stifled by the fact that there's not an accurate diagnosis to reflect what's happening because it's based on a medical model, which is about money a lot of the time. So they may be getting medicated for an issue or symptom that is really not addressing the root cause, which is developmental trauma. And so just being able to kind of get the knowledge through resources like this. This is another really good book called What Happened to You. And so this asks that question. So a lot of the time what will be asked when you're faced with or seeing a symptom, a behavioral symptom or a mental health condition is, what's wrong with you? And this book talks about asking the question, what happened to you? Which is a different perspective to treat from. And so this is another really good book I recommend, and they're really easy, quick reads. I promise you they're not quick. One of those books that you're like, I can't understand. They're very straightforward written, so I was able to read them myself, because usually they'll sit on my bookshelf. So I recommend getting those books if you want to learn more about the impact of trauma and how to work with healing, with children and healing developmental trauma. So that's it. That's pretty much it. That's my time.